because I think we just need to let those blessings just sink in. That you just made the City of Light, Bradford, even more radiant with that singing. It was incredible, soul lifting, and I also found it very soul lifting to find out you're from Kent as well. So I'm from Kent too.
Right, okay. There's connections.
I'm actually going to open up to the floor because I think there's only about 15 minutes or something like that. So if anyone had any questions about the earlier discussion that the Sheikh Idris was mentioning, talking about, please raise your hand, and I think there's a microphone that's going around.
Has anyone got a question? There's a gentleman there.
Right at the back.
Anyone got a mic for him? You can take one of these. Yeah.
Oh, right.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for a very beautiful recitation. You had mentioned earlier in your discussion about how even though people in West Africa were finding it really difficult to go all the way to Mecca, and so were missing that spiritual connection. And then you gave the example of what modern day Muslims in Britain need to think about. I was wondering if you could give some more advice on how Muslims here can feel connected without obviously having to deal with all of the baggage that they may not want to, but take whatever spiritual guidance they can from their faith.
Yeah, I mean, really, in terms of what can we do today, in terms of to find ourselves, I think the best thing is to get out of your environment first and foremost. That could be spiritually, or that could be spiritually, or it could be physically. You know, if I only can talk about my journey because everyone's journey is different. So for me, the advantage of being able to leave England and being a completely different culture, I think it gives you the ability to be able to differentiate between the positives and negatives of your culture and where we need to head. And I think when you get out of your environment, and Joseph Campbell speaks about this in The Hero's Journey, which I'm very, passionate about, because it's this element, it's this sense of you are on a journey, you just got to tread it. And there's always, throughout your life, you've got these circles of separation, i.e. moving from your comfort zone, the way you see life and the way you feel comfortable as life is. Life is about always constant separation to a new sense of consciousness, and then a initiation into that and what that brings, and then a return back with a different perspective to where you were initially. And so traveling really is, helps that process. Me going away and finding significance in another place and becoming, what's so important, what we have to do, I think one of the keys to really developing as a human being is curiosity, that sense of just being open to the experience and thinking, wow, I can learn so much from this. Rather than becoming closed and thinking you're threatening my space, this is my comfort zone, and this is how I do things and I'm not changing. This is where all the problems come, I think, in life. And so it's that element of, okay, I'm going to open up and be curious. I don't understand that, or I don't agree with that, but I'll put it to the back. Oh, I can. That resonates with me. This is what I need. I'm moving on. And so, especially for the young community, it's really interesting that in the Christian community in America, I've noticed, and not just restricted within the Christian community, they have these transition programs. And what they do is, what they noticed in America is that just taking your child to church every week, and Sunday school and summer camp and so forth, doesn't guarantee that your child's going to remain a Christian and have a Christian identity. Rather, they find, if you just take that for granted, that I'm taking them to these institutions and they're going to educate my child, what they find is that what you end up, I can't remember the term, is it trailing, when when a car's taking the velocity, the pull of the car in front of it? Yes, does anyone know what that term is? Tailgating, where you're basically taking the pull so you don't have to do any work. And so what the community is doing is just expecting the next generation to basically just fall into line and just mould into the the same mould that they have. But what they find is that when those children move from school to college, within 2 years, 80% of them lose their faith. And the reason is because they don't have the tools to do life right. They're just thrown into this arena where, you know, they've got no capability, no ability to really assert themselves. They haven't developed those skills. And so the way they saw a solution to this problem was that they had a transition period. They said, don't send your children to college immediately. Have a gap year. For the first 6 months of the academic year, we're going to just teach them how to do life right, how to deal with money, how to deal with dating and the opposite sex, and you know, and so forth and so forth. Just life skills, not Bible college. Then in what's interesting I found, in the last 3 months of the program, they send them to an impoverished country where they just do relief work, and they don't have mobile phones, they don't have McDonald's, they don't have flat screen plasma TV screens, and they just basically got to see how someone else lives who's less fortunate and contribute. They say these people come back completely transformed, and that's what's needed. It's that hero's journey of separation from their environment, initiation into a new environment, and then going back. And so I think that's really important for our youth to be able to do that, to find an identity. And that we have to, as parents as well, realise that we are disempowering our children by controlling them and dictating to them what they need to do. And so that when they go into their adult life, they just completely collapse and they can't take on the role of responsibility. And for the males, this is devastating, and males suffer more from this, I feel, to a certain extent, because they go in, and when they come to marriage, which I believe marriage is one of the only, you've got marriage, and then you've got marriage, and then you've got parenting. These are the last two real bastions of chivalry that we have to move the male from childhood to manhood. It's the only thing left, and unfortunately, it's a complete mess. And so it all starts with a soul searching that I have to find myself, and no matter how scary that may be, I've got to find my place in this world. And then we can come back, become contributors and assert ourselves with the sort of strength that's needed to combat these people with evil intentions towards our community and want to manipulate the social consciousness regarding Muslims. Does that answer your question?
I think that more than answers it, actually. It's really interesting what you say about restriction as well. That's the way we often view faith. A lot of people view faith, actually, and that's in the media too. It's about do's and don'ts. It's not actually dynamic and beautiful and holistic. So, yeah.
And education, what does education mean? It means to allow that thing to flower, basically, to develop in the person, not shove it down their throat, which is the education systems like that. You know, this is just not a Muslim problem. This is a human problem, is that we are dictating to people how they must be, and it stunts them. And what you get from that, you get two reactions. You get complete passivity, where they feel like no vibrancy, no passion for life, and they just live in a virtual world, so they're not engaging. Yeah, and that just leads to mental health problems, you know, to the nth degree. And then the other extreme is absolute, rebellion, resistance to it. So you've got these two extremes, and we've got to find a balance between them.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Kind of following on from that, how do you see the importance of recitation of texts such as the Dalail Khayrat and the Burda and the traditional Arabic forms of devotional worship? Because I find that a lot of, obviously communities such as your own that really preserve these, and this is a very important aspect of your own worship. And then you do get pockets of Muslim communities that are very disconnected from this, and it is kind of the more cut and dry and legalistic or theological. So how important do you see these as kind of the spiritual sustenance of the Muslim community, especially for young people, and especially in a context, maybe in a Christian, maybe post-Christian society where worship is preserved, or we're more familiar with worship in a kind of musical tradition, and this is kind of the Islamic equivalent of that, in terms of preserving the kind of soul of, and the kind of barakah and associated things which come from recitation of these texts. So how do you see the importance of those
Yeah, I mean, first of all, foremost, I think that Muslims, we are realising it, and we have to realise it, that the arts are probably the most powerful way of sort of changing the social, the greater consciousness of Islam. And I think recently, even on BBC, just recently, they've just had Islamic architecture and art, is it? Yeah, this is, and because this is what beauty draws people. And we need the wider community. The wider community need to see that, and we need to experience that as well. And this is what I'm going to talk about in my next talk: is this complete dichotomy and split between the right and brain hemispheres, and what problem it's causing. Is that the left brain, very logical, very rational, and very dry, without soul and spirit, though. If we present Islam in that way, we will never feel rooted. And we will always go to extremes. We're always going to be going from one extreme to the other. We need to feel rooted. Every person, I feel, which is, it's a sensitive topic, they have to accept that they are connected to their tradition, regardless of they're rebelling it or not. They have to come to some sort of acceptance that it's part of them. Because if you don't, it leads to an element of self-hate, a schizophrenic sort of identity, and split. And so Muslims, we have to go back, and it's not that we can't take this sort of Protestant approach where you just go back to the source without forgetting where it developed. It's impossible to do that. We have to see how it developed to understand where we're going and understand, because life is a constant development. It's constantly organically growing in a way, and we need to. And within studying that, you understand what God wants from you. And so, if you completely cut and dismiss that off, it's very dangerous for yourself, and it's dangerous for the community around you. You have to some extent, accept it. And so that was my, in my story, that's what I was trying to portray to people, is that me, by feeling very disconnected as a youth, is that once coming back to a culture that now I've become part of, it grounds you, and you feel rooted. And it's not just about, and one thing I keep preaching to Muslims is academic Islam will not save the next generation. In fact, they will hate the religion, I believe, if it's just purely academic, because they've got academia being shoved down their throat at schools, and then we come after school and we just, giving them more academic Islam. Islam has to have a connection, and these practices that we're doing here, it touches the soul, I'm hoping. We feel as a vessel, we're channeling something, and that's why this is so. But this is a tradition, and at the beginning, I completely forgot to mention the people who gave me this tradition. But I have to thank Hajj Ismail Filali, who's he's still carrying on this tradition. He inherited it from his father, and it's this collective tradition of the Dalail Khayrat. It's about the actual collective recitation of the Dalail Khayrat in Fez. I actually discovered only recently is only about 200 to 250 years old. So it doesn't go back to Imam Jazuli. Before, it was a very personal. The Dalail Khayrat, what you'll see in other Muslim countries, it's more of a devotional book that one would read by themselves. You rarely see it, from what I see, than people reading it as a collective. But then in the last 200 years in Fez, one personality, he brought them all together. And so Ismail Filali brought that, so I'll ask God to preserve him and give him good health. And the other and his son is actually carrying this on as well. And then we have pockets of this, pockets of these gatherings in Peterborough with Tawqir Tufail. He met me in Morocco, and I introduced him to this, and he became very passionate about it. And then we have Mohammed Khizr in Birmingham. He's the strongest one, really. He goes to Morocco regularly and helps Hajj Ismail, because he's quite old now. And really beautifully in Fez, if you ever get to see him, Hajj Al-Ayyashi, he's an elderly man from the desert. He lives in Fez. He's about 110 years old, and he's still alive, and he's memorized the whole of most of the people in Fez that have continued this, he memorized it from beginning to end, which is a very difficult text to end. Another interesting thing is that in Mawli Idris, when we used to sit there was one particular woman that was probably in her 50s, between 50 and 60. She'd memorise the whole Dalail, and she would sit there by the side, reciting it with them as well. And so it's dying. I will admit it's dying, in that the next generation are not really carrying it on like they do, and they actually have to give them bribes to get them there. They say you'll get some money if you read the Dalail. that's how it happens. And so, but it is continuing, and I think it's essential. Does that answer your question?
I was about to ask something, but no, I'll open up to it.
There's another question? It does.
Also, is it more common to do it on your own rather than in a collective?
In Morocco, no. Well, it's what you want to do with it. I mean, my passion was the collective. Why? Because I felt that we really needed to connect. We live in a society that's very disconnected. That this aspect of me sitting in and seeing someone next to me, we're attuning, and we talk about this in the polyvagal theory of Stephen Porges, about the importance, in therapy now, they use choirs as a means to help mental illness, because what you're doing is, when you're singing, you close your eyes and you try to attune to the other person. And most mental health issues is an issue of feeling disconnected. So when you're singing, especially when you focus purely on the voice, you close your eyes. Like my teachers in Morocco, they said a real singer, he closes his eyes to absorb, but he's not just absorbing, he's absorbing the meanings of what he's reciting, but he's also trying to connect, like tune into a mindful practice, basically, of tuning into what the other person's singing. And so there's a connection through the voice. There's a connection through the face as well, and that we are looking at one another reciting. It becomes sort of a competitive thing, and so everyone's having a good old go, shouting back who can do it better. So there's a sort of like healthy sort of competition as well, where you're engaging with one another. So I found that very profound. And what's something was a practice they have in fairs is quite beautiful. They have a bucket in the middle with water, and their understanding is that when we're reciting these prayers, they're actually, the barakah, the blessing of it, is descending on the water. So then they would share it together at the end and drink it as if it's a healing. And
nod back to the well with the sweet water.
No. I mean, that would be very interesting. I mean, that story is really, it's mentioned, that story. It's quite folkloric. But what bringing us to the role of the feminine here, which is really interesting, I just find it, you find many of those sorts of stories about like you have to put it into the context of the time, like an uneducated woman, that's the sign of someone that's not really got any education, but she has a connection, okay? And we have a famous story about Imam al-Razi. He's walking down the street with his entourage of students, and they're saying, make way for the Imam, the Imam of Islam, the leader of the Muslims. And this one elderly woman's walking, and she's in the way. And they say, get out the way, woman. And he says, what? Why? He says, what? He says, do you not know Imam al-Razi's coming? And she says, who's he? Yeah. And they went, what a... and said, And so it said, this is the man that's wrote 100 proofs for the existence of God. She said 100 proofs for 100 doubts. So she put him in his place, basically. And this is a very similar story of the man, that Imam Jazuli can't get the water from the well, and this girl walks along, spits in it, and it soars up with water, and she says, she says exactly the same thing in the story. You're the Imam of Islam? You can't even get water from the well? Yeah. And so it's a symbol of that, don't discredit people. Just because they're not educated doesn't mean they don't have a contact with God. And that was very profound for me in Morocco, because a friend of mine that studied in Syria, he came to me and he said, Syria nearly killed me. I said, why is that? He says, because in Syria, and let's not just speak specifically about Syria, but the East, we can appreciate this from a subcontinent background, is image is everything. The Imam there's a certain way the scholar has to be. But even before he gets on the stage, he has all these these lines of introduction, his names, he is this and he's that and he's this, just to pump up the crowd to sort of. But in Morocco, the scholars, one of my teachers, God bless him, was really not, sometimes he'd pick his nose, he didn't really care. And, one of my teachers, he'd say to me, this old man, because in the Qaraween, some of the teachers were so old, and they'd be sitting there, and he says, do you know why I'm always early at 8 o'clock in the morning and I'm always here before you? He says, why is that? And he went, because we said, because knowledge is so important, you have to respect it. He said, no. He says, my wife's trying to kick me out so she can bring all her friends over. so it shows that in Morocco, he says, Morocco brought me back. He says, the East killed me because it was all about image. He says, Morocco, I got all my perceptions were shattered. And that's sort of what these sort of stories are trying to get at. And so, don't discredit people. Allah's, He can, and Allah can bring His religion, and He can bring the beauty of His religion wherever He wishes. And it can happen in Kent, it can happen in Keighley, it can happen wherever. And so, we shouldn't discredit people, and often we do that.
Fez is such a beautiful. I've had the opportunity to go there, and
Yes.
it is just, you feel the sacredness around you.
Yes.
It is incredible. Sorry. What you said about the feminine sort of the ladies in the stories.
Yes.
Yeah. So what about feminine role models? You touched on it.
Yeah. Then this always comes up. This topic. It's sort of being highlighted more now. I think we have women role models. We have them obviously through one of the greatest transmitter of prophetic traditions is his own wife. Hafsa and then Aisha. May God be pleased with them both. And we have plenty of information about her. But there is the thing that's so important is it continued, and we do see that. Like Dr. Akram Nadawi has translated a book on the Hadith scholars, female scholars of Islam. It's 290 or so pages, and that's his introduction to a 40-volume work on it. And so now it's coming out, and Dr. Omar Abdallah has done a whole lecture series on famous women in Islam. Ibn Arabi in his Sufis of Andalusia, he mentions about 74. He does mention 4 of his female teachers. Okay, but we know that Ibn al-Najjar, for example, a famous Moroccan scholar, he had 400 female teachers. And so women have a role, and Dr. Akram is not just listing them, he's actually expounding on their lives. And so that's very important. And I think if we see it now, women today, they really do, I think more than any time in history, they need role models, because the women's role in society is so drastically changed, where basically we live in a genderless society. That's the reality of it. Men and women have very similar roles, and we're all struggling with that, how we deal with that. And so women do role models, and we see this being personified in movies like Star Wars, and all these movies now, they're all they're all feminine, the heroine in the stories. And people, all the boys are disgruntled, saying, where's Luke? And Luke's like this, completely marginalised, broken character, and the woman's the one bringing him back. And people complain about that, but that's the reality of our times. I say these movies, they only personify what's in the collective consciousness. And so I think it's really important that women do have these roles, and we have them. In Islamic history, they're there. It's just they were neglected at a certain time. We have to be honest towards our tradition, but they've been discovered now.
And also, Rabia Ladawi has a huge influence over the development of Islamic spirituality.
Oh,
as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, sorry, one last one I forgot. What's really interesting, because I'm really interested in relationships, there's a really interesting podcast called Relationship Alive, by Neil Sattin. And what I really find a new discourse interesting, because John Gray wrote Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. But he's rewritten the whole book now. And because they say the whole didactics have changed now. The discourse is not about men and women. He says that's destructive to the modern relationship. It's about the feminine and the masculine. Because if you analyse people as men are this and women are that, that's a paradigm that doesn't necessarily run true in every relationship. And you can say, oh, you're doing that, and you're interpreting it and projecting the book on the person, when that's not the case. And so they've changed the whole discourse now to the masculine and the feminine, because men display feminine attributes. And when we say the feminine and the masculine, we're talking the active and the passive and all these qualities. And women display masculine qualities. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was a complete balance of that. We see that as Muslims, is that he personified the greatest masculine qualities and the greatest feminine qualities. So it's described, like if you think about heroes, the Prophet is described as one of the most bashful people. And you don't think of bashfulness and shyness as a quality of manhood. It's about asserting yourself. It's that quality of, like, he was shy and embarrassed at certain times. And we see that, like Peter Sanders touched upon that in the Chinese culture, is that they have that embedded in their culture, that sort of shyness. And so I think that's really interesting. So the Prophet, peace and blessings, is seen as a role model for men and for women. Of course, he has certain qualities that have to be specific for men, and so forth. But there is so much to take from him, whether you're a woman or not. Does that answer your question? And there's Terence Real. Sorry, I can walk my way. Terence Real is really interesting because he went to the Maasai culture in East Africa, and he said he saw these Maasai men, these strong men, but were skinny, which is really interesting. In traditional sculptures, women were big and men were skinny, but that skinniness was a strength. Like he was talking to Peter Sanders yesterday about Mauritanians. The men drink the camel's milk because it makes them strong. They give them cow's milk to the women because it fattens them up, because that's what they like in their culture. He says when he went to these Maasais, he saw manhood in them, but they would walk hand in hand down the streets. And I saw that in Morocco, men holding hands, men sitting on one another's laps in the bus. And I had some friends that would stroke my neck, and I went, away, that's a bit too much, mate. So I got connected to this sense of you can express your love for another man without it being sexual. And that's a maturity, that we can hug without it being sexual, we can touch without it being sexual. And he asked the Maasai leaders, what's it mean to be a man? And he said, a man is you're tough when you need to be tough, and you're soft when you need to be soft. And that was a really important message, I think.
So interesting. Are there any other? There's a question. Oh, no, third.
I just wanted to, so one of the aspects that I've found out today about the Dalail is it seems to be a way of preserving the attributes of the Prophet. And it was interesting to me that in Turkish tradition, you have the Hilya with the Hadith of Ali, and obviously in going towards the Middle East, you've got the Shama'il. I wondered whether you have experience of other ways of preserving the life and attributes of the Prophet.
That's very interesting. I mean, so other ways of preserving it, we've seen, I looked at basically, and I didn't look at the Hilya, so thank you for highlighting that. The Hilya is basically the sandal of the Prophet, which, the description, not the Hilya is a description, the outward qualities. So it's part of the Shamanic tradition. The Shamanic tradition is the study of his outward attributes and his inward attributes. His khalq and khuluq, his exterior and his inward. And so basically we have, usually people study the Prophet by looking at his life, the seerah. So that's more of an academic approach. And alhamdulillah, we've got plenty of literature now. I think the two best that I've seen personally, Yasser Qadhi's is very good. He goes into great depth. And now we've got Abdul Nasser Janga. He's still going. He's done about 200. And then we have Martin Ings, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's done. He's contributed as well. So I think there's a whole depth there. What I'm moving it to now in terms of is how, instead of keep going through the details, how do we see the hero's journey in the Prophet's life, and taking the 12 steps of the hero's journey, which they use within film and cinema, how do we bring that into the Prophet's life? So it's making the seerah more thematic than going through details, and seeing how that's significant to our life. Then we've got the Shamanic tradition, is we look at the qualities inwardly and outwardly. Then we've got the connection to people trying to implement that. That's another way of connecting to the Prophet, peace and blessing beyond. The salat and the salam, the durood, the conveying greetings to him. And then, so the Hilya really is sort of a strand of the Shamanic, really, to be honest. And then the new what's becoming even more common and being revived is this concept of the sandal as well. This connection to, like, they're basically following in the footsteps. It's symbolic. You say, why not put the image of a sandal on your wall? But the idea is it's symbolic. We're in his footsteps and so forth. And so that's another tradition that's becoming alive. Brother Saqib, he's got his blessed sandal and so forth. Before I forget as well, Mr. Ijaz, he's at the back and he's selling the book and other books. I'm welcome. I've got to be cautious of time because I'm conscious of time because I don't know when my next talk is. I think it's at 1:30, but I will try to sign copies if people wish to do so. But they are at the back of the books. So one more question.
If there's one more question, otherwise we'll wrap up. Any questions? No. Okay then. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair to you and to the the Merry Muslims. I don't know how to call you, the band of Merry Muslims.
We'll find a name.
It was exceptional and uplifting. Thank you so much, and please join me in thanking Sheikh Idris Watts.